Hello, and welcome back to another editing tutorial, I guess. So I did one of these before, you might have caught it, and it was a little bit more of a general how to get started, I suppose, with Premiere, and what you need to know to get into it. But I figured I'd do another one as a follow-up on a bit more of an effects-based kind of path, I guess. There are a couple of effects that I tend to use more often than others, obviously. And then I figured I'd go through them and just explain sort of what they are, what they do, and how I use them. But I will, however, mention that there is an effects pack that works with Adobe Premiere and Adobe After Effects, as far as I'm aware, that is called Red Giant Universe. If I just search here for RG Uni, we'll get a bunch of Red Giant Universe presets. And if I just make a little cut here and apply one of these to this particular clip, you can see that there's one that's just called Glitch. Now, what this does, if you apply this to a clip, it'll make it look all, well, glitchy essentially, and it'll randomize glitches throughout the clip. And you can go into your effects panel and you can choose a bunch of presets. You can change it around by yourself. If you don't want a bunch of small glitches, you can remove them. If you want more small glitches, you can add them. Same with the white glitches, more or less white glitches, if you want compression on it or not at all. Now, if you've seen the stereotypical VHS effect on footage on YouTube, this is usually what you'd see. If you just drag this VHS effect on, you'd see that it starts to look like a VHS tape. So you'll get a bunch of presets. You can make it look like it's fast forwarding, and it starts to do a bunch of like these wavy lines that you'd see in a VHS tape when you fast forward. So it's a very useful tool pack to quickly and sort of consistently add a bunch of effects to your footage, but it is a yearly subscription service that does cost money. I never had this before. This is not something I started out with. This is something that I started exploring more in the past year, let's say. So the first effect that I wanted to show off and explain a little bit, I think, is the effect that most people have been curious about, which is the effect that I used to use for a lot of the anti stuff, a lot of the glitchy stuff. Wave Warp. This is the majority of what I use for any glitchy footage. If you just drag it onto your clip, it won't probably look that promising, but I'll show you what you'd do with this. So by default, it's doing this. It's making the footage wavy. Oddly enough, and can make people look very angry. However, you have a bunch of settings over here, and check this out. If you change the direction, first of all, to 0 instead of 90 degrees, then you'll start getting horizontal lines instead of vertical. And if you change the wave type to sawtooth, for example, look at this. You start to get the VHS effect instead of the wavy effect. This is something that I tended to use a lot in the past when I wanted to do the fast forward, typical sort of flickery effect. So I'd use this, but I'd set the wave speed to something higher, and then the wave width to something really high, so that you only get maybe like one. Let me extend this example clip. So there you go. You see that you have this sort of wavy type effect going across the screen pretty quickly in this case, but you get the picture. If I exaggerate this even more with a wave height displacement, you can see that you can just really pull these guys apart. And onto this, maybe I would add a gamma correction, because VHS tapes tend to be a little bit desaturated and faded over time, so I'd maybe set this to 8 or even 7, just to sort of bring out a little bit more of the detail. And you can see what's happening here. Let me slow the wave speed down to maybe 10. It's a pretty decent, well, it's exaggerated for effect, but it's a pretty decent way of doing a fast forward type of thing if you want it to look like a VHS effect. Maybe add some noise on top of that. But what I did for the glitchier stuff is a combination of this and a little bit more of an advanced technique that I'll show you in a second. But if you set the sawtooth to noise instead, it's gonna look weird. However, if you set the wave width up to something crazy like 4,000, bam, suddenly you start to see this sort of blocky, chunky pattern going on instead. You can see here on his torso and on his face that it's getting there, right? It's starting to look like glitching instead of just a noise. You can even go higher to, let's double it, 8,000, why not? And now you're getting this sort of like general displacement all over his entire body and the entire picture, really. This is something that really helps if you have a green screen, because then you can do it to just a character without affecting the background. But using this effect with a bunch of different, you can pin all the sides. One of the issues I found when using this is that, let me see if I exaggerate this a lot more, you can see that it's showing the edges of the footage and it sort of breaks it a little bit because it doesn't look like a physical glitch effect that's happening within the world. It just looks like, well, the footage is glitching. So you can pin sides, and in this case I would just pin the vertical edges, which will pin all of the sides, but not top and bottom. So you'd still get glitches down here and up here, but it'll sort of taper off the closer it gets to the edge of the footage. So if we bring this back to 7-ish, you can see that we're still glitching all of the footage, but not the edges, which is a pretty solid way, I think, of fixing this, especially if you have the glitches around, I don't know, 25. It's not going to be noticeable that there's less glitching towards the edges, but you won't get the weird showing through of the background. So that is the main glitching effect. Now let's make it a little bit more complicated. If you want to do a separation of RGB colors, there isn't really a good way of doing a chromatic aberration effect inside of Premiere. If I search for chromatic, the only thing that shows up is the RG Universe Red Giant thing that I mentioned earlier. And it doesn't really separate them as much as just makes it look a little bit... This is a good effect for maybe a drunk vision or a druggy, trippy vision, or a quick transition between types of footage, because it only really makes the edges of the screen kind of blurry and kind of chromatic, but it doesn't affect the whole image the way I'd want it. So the way you'd have to do it if you want to separate the RGB colors, the way I did it for most of the footage that I've done glitchy effects on, is to take a copy of this footage that we want to make split. So by holding down Alt, I can just click and drag footage and it just creates a copy. And I'll make 3 layers, one for red, green, and blue. Then onto the top layer, I'll keep everything the same, but on the top layer, I'll add an effect called Channel Mixer. So here you have an effect called Channel Mixer. And if you drop this on, you see that you get red, green, and blue control. And if I set the green and the blue to 0, this layer is going to show only the red channel for the image in this case. And then I'll go to the next layer and I'll apply the exact same thing, but I'll remove red and blue. So now this is our green channel. If I hide the red, you'll see this is just green. And then on the bottom one, I'll do the exact same thing again, but I'll remove red and green. So this is now our blue channel. And then I'll bring all of them back and I'll set the blend mode for each layer to additive. So if I add them back together, then they'll create the exact same original image, but I'll have layers for each channel. So now I can go into, say, the red one, for example, and I can maybe scale it up to 102, and suddenly we get this weird red separation because the red channel is larger. And then I can go to the green layer and maybe go into the wave warp and change the phasing of it. So now we get a different split for just the green, but the rest of it remains the same. So you can see how you can sort of build these up. You can even change, I would recommend keeping 1 at default, because otherwise it might get a little bit too messy. But I could even go into the blue one and change the wave width for some reason, and really just make the blue ones big chunks instead, or maybe larger separation. And well, you see the effect. This is something that you'd have to just play around with to taste. I would recommend, if you want to do a glitchy effect, to split these layers up a bit, sort of unevenly, and maybe on this one, you just delete it, and maybe over here you'll add more noise suddenly to just like a couple of frames and then bring it way back down again, so that it's a little bit uneven and messy, so that when you play this back, it's sort of just jumping around a bunch. And that way you get the sort of glitchy, unregulated, chaotic effect that you'd probably want out of a glitch, I would assume. You could even hold some of these, freeze frame on them, whatever you like. It's all about experimenting and how intense you want it. But the wave warp is sort of the key effect to this effect. Moving on, another effect that I tend to use fairly often, especially lately, is an effect called Spherize. So if I just search for Spherize, it shows up here. I drag it onto my clip, and this is a very simple effect. It's nowhere near as complicated as the first one. All it does is it bulges the layer or the footage that you've put it onto. So if I wanted to make his face sort of large and weird, maybe he's really smart in this case, I'll put that on. And if I want this to follow, because now if I play the footage back, obviously it's just gonna stay in one spot. Let me extend this example clip. It's just gonna stay in one spot as he moves out of it, and now his face is just curved instead of large. So if I want this to follow him, then I would have to manually keyframe that. So let me select the effect. You can see where the center is, the center of influence here. Let me keep that on his nose, and I would have to make a keyframe for the sphere and just essentially scroll through the footage and manually keep this on top of his nose throughout, so that the effect follows his face. There you go. Now his face is large-ish for the entire clip. And if you want it even larger, that's the one thing I would say that I miss with the Spherize effect, is a size modifier. So if I want this even larger, I would recommend doing the tracking, manual tracking first, and then you can just copy paste it, and it'll retain the keyframes that you just made, but it'll add the effect back on top again. So it'll make it even larger, and then it'll still keep the animation that you just did with the keyframes. And that way you'd get as large as you want to, without having a weird edge around your footage. And by weird edge, I'll show you what I mean. I mean, if you put on the magnify instead, which does have a size value, a magnification value, the problem with this is that while it does magnify things, it does have a hard edge. So you could zoom in on his head and you could position this where you'd want it. The problem is that you would have to feather the edges. It works for certain things, but you don't get a clean gradient over to what's been enlarged. You get a sort of soft edge. So you can see how it starts to cause issues where other things sort of pop into its sphere of influence. So I prefer to use Spherize for that. That was Spherize. Quick and easy. Next up is an effect called Echo. And this is not Echo for sound, this is Echo for image, which sounds a little bit weird, but it's definitely something that I did use a lot, especially on the anti stuff and those types of things where you need. I used it a lot on the Jameson footage, old-timey footage, to sort of simulate a double exposure of footage. And I'll show you what it does if I set this echo to, well, more than 1. First of all, I'll set it to 5 for an example. It will mess up the footage, and if you just drop it on like this, you'd think, oh, I don't want this. What's happening here? But let me just extend this time. You can sort of see it already on his head here, but it's creating essentially ghost images. And if I extend the time, that'll adjust how long between the ghost images. So you can see that I start bending my fingers and then bend, and there goes the 5th iteration. You can set this to however many you want. Obviously it'll affect performance, but it creates ghost images this amount of time after your initial action. Or if you drag it into the minuses, it'll go before. So it'll start showing up before you actually do the thing. In this case, bending my fingers. But let's keep it here. And then you can also set them to fade over time. So if I go through here, They're fading over time, and I can set how much or how little I want them to do that. Now, it's adding the layers on top of each other, which is why it's getting brighter and brighter per layer. However, you can set this to maximum and minimum. If I set it to maximum, you'll see that it's creating this weird sort of smudgy, I don't even know how to describe it, effect. It's not adding or subtracting intensity, but it's adding the colors of the layers on top of each other in sort of a weird, wacky way. And minimum works the same way, but it sort of only does it with the dark parts. You can see on his hat here, it's creating a lot of smudgy, weird, sort of trippy. His arm is almost disappearing into itself before it sort of catches up with itself again. I don't know how to describe this effect, but it is a very useful effect for creating sort of surreal and weird, I don't know, motion of exposure or errors in footage or just ghostly images, but it's definitely useful for creating surrealist footage or dream sequences, or maybe someone has been knocked on the head and they're seeing double or whatever. There's a lot of applications that you can use this for, and it's a fun effect. So that was echo. The fourth effect that I want to mention is an audio effect, and it's just reverb. If I just search for reverb, you'll get a bunch of them. I don't know really what the difference is. The convolution reverb is the one that I always use because it has the best settings, I think. You just drop it on, hit edit, and then you get a bunch of settings here. Now, my preferred setting that I just like the sound of, you can play around with these and whatever you want it to sound like, obviously. Find your own path. But I like corner reverberation, and I like it to sound like a massive cavern because it just gives you good echo. If I play this back now, you can hear the echo. I can't hear the echo because I'm not wearing headphones. But if I just compare that to the default, you can see that it sounds sort of not great, not super fantastic. But if I set it back to corner reverberation and then the massive cavern, you can play around with the room size and the mix. I would recommend. You do have a gain here if you want it to sound louder or quieter, depending on the situation for your echo. But the mix in general and the room size are the two major points that you'd want to mess around with. Obviously, the bigger the room, the more the echo. But the mix definitely affects that greatly as well. If you pull the mix all the way up to 100, you'll get none of the original sound and only the echo effect, which doesn't always sound too great because it does muddle the sound a lot and you can barely hear the original. So usually I'd keep it around halfway point somewhere and then play around room size depending on the echo that I want.
Fools get wise. Quick, before the fools get wise.
And there you go, you have a decent type of echo. I like the corner vibration, I like the distant source depending, but most of them, they kind of sound the same. I mean, it's a reverb effect. I just thought I'd mention it. The last effect that I want to point out is transform. Now, you might ask yourself, why bother with a transform effect? You have transformation controls here. You can scale it, you can move it, you can rotate it, and yeah, you have the power to do these things, but this does not give you the power of motion blur. So, transform as an effect, it's a distortion effect, apply that, and then I'll show you quickly the difference here. If I go from here and then I zoom, I make a quick zoom in on his face from here to here. I'll zoom in just right there, because why not? If I just do this with the normal tool that is applied to every video clip, you can see that it just zooms in as straightforward, just a zoom in, nothing else happens. It works, but it doesn't look cool. So let me delete those, and then I'll do the same effect on the transformation tool instead. I'll do a zoom in right here to there. Now by default, you're not gonna see any difference here. It's still doing the same thing. It's just zooming straight in, just like we did before. However, if you uncheck the composition shutter angle checkbox, you now have individual control of the motion blur. So I can set the shutter angle to 150, and check this out. Bam. Suddenly you have motion blur for the movement of the clip. And this applies to rotation, position, scale, whatever you do inside of the transformation effect. If you're using a version of Premiere that is earlier than 2019, I think for some reason the scale only goes to 300, but since they've updated it, it does go above and beyond. But that's how you get motion blur on footage. Moving on, those were the major effects that I tend to use more often than not. A quick shout out, I guess, to the gamma correction, because I do use it a lot. If there is any gameplay footage that I find is just too damn dark, like this, if this was a Let's Play, I would probably not upload this to YouTube as is. I would like to apply a gamma correction of maybe 8, just so that it's still spooky and dark, but you can see what happens, especially when you tend to watch this back as a video. You might have it open in a tab on your computer, and there might be brighter things around you that sort of your eye compensates out, and it makes the footage seem too dark. Even if it's supposed to be a dark and spooky video for the player, I tend to want the viewer to be able to see a little bit more than the player does, just to sort of keep you in the loop, depending on your viewing situation. If you're watching it on a phone in a brightly lit room, you might not be able to see everything otherwise. So gamma correction is a great way of doing that. On top of gamma correction, if you do push it too far, you do start to see, well, all of these artifacts. So I probably wouldn't go below 7 ever on the gamma correction. And if I still find that it's too dark, I would add a curves luma. So if I drag that on, I can just affect the bright parts without touching the dark parts. If I boost the dark, you can see that, well, we're starting to get that weird sort of compression effect again, because all footage is going to be compressed to some degree. But if I keep that low, and maybe keep the dark parts fairly low, I can still boost the lighter parts a little bit, and give the image a touch more brightness without revealing too much of the compression artifacting. But that is an extreme case if the game is very, very, very dark and you can barely see anything at all. So gamma correction, definite go-to. That is it for the effects that I didn't cover in the last video and that I most often use. Now, I do want to mention some techniques as well, or just some tools in general for workflow. So let's get into list number 2. I'll make the other ones numbered, and then I'll do these ones lettered. So one thing that I had some issues with when I was starting out is how to make the footage move the way I want to if I want to keyframe things around. So let me just set a keyframe here for my footage, just a position keyframe, move forward a bit, and maybe I want it to move over here, and then I want it to slow down and just move a little bit, and then I want it to move maybe back into position. Maybe this is a face cam that you want to zoom in and slow down and then zoom out again, something like that. So if we now just play this back, you can see that it goes there, and then it does like a weird little loopy motion. This is something that I found really annoying, and I don't know why this is default. But if you do select your keyframes and check out this little loopy path here, let me even zoom in on this so that we can see it a little bit better. We want this to be a straight path between these 2 points, right? Not a weird little loopy one. You just select your keyframes, right-click them. Instead of going to temporal interpolation that we did last time for easing them in and out and making it smooth, you go to spatial interpolation. And instead of auto Bezier, you just set it to linear. Slam. Now we have them going straight between these 2 points. And we have the footage moving exactly the way we want to. We have it coming down here, slowly going up and then going back. So, interpolating your keyframes the proper way is the key to keyframing, I suppose. Just set it to linear, it'll work better. Okay, another technique, technique B, I guess, is tracking faces. Now, if you want to do this inside of Premiere, you will have to do it manually. Let's say you're zooming in on a camera or zooming in on something and it's moving or they're moving. We'll zoom in on this guy's face, just put him right up front, right there. And we want that worried face to remain in screen, in center of the screen as the camera moves around. So to do that, I would have to manually set a keyframe for where his face is where I want it. Let's say centered right there. I can even right click and enable the safe margins, which will give you the title safe for TV and stuff. But let's keep his face centered, and then I'll move forward to the next keyframe, move it back to center, scroll, 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 and keep it in center. And then I'll select all of my keyframes and set them to Bezier, which is going to just keep the motion flowing throughout and not go start, stop, start, 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 stop, like a linear would. And now, if I play it back, you'll see that his face does remain in the center of the screen. And this is basically the way you'd have to do it if someone is moving around their face and you want to track it, or whatever you want to do inside of Premiere. If you want to use After Effects, we'll move on to tip technique C. So what you can do if you have After Effects installed as well is just right-click the footage and choose Replace with After Effects Composition. If you do this, rather than rendering out the specific portion you might want to apply specific effects to, or importing the whole clip, all of the footage in After Effects and doing something there, you can do this, and Premiere will make this clip that you've selected into a linked, connected After Effects composition. It'll say, do you want to save this? I'll just save it as, why not? Test. And then it'll take the exact same clip you just selected, put it in After Effects, and now you can do whatever the hell you want in here. You can use the trackers for After Effects, you can use all of the effects, all of the layer features, possibilities that After Effects gives you. I'm not going to go through that now, but whatever you do in here, let's say that for some reason I wanted to do this just to rotate the footage 180 degrees. When I do this and I save my project, if I then go back into Premiere, every change that I make inside of After Effects will be applied here, and this will now be a linked composition. So that's super useful if you want to track something, if you want to attach something to someone's eyes. For example, you want to make eyes black, or you want to just attach an image to someone's face so that it moves with them or whatever. You just do that here, add a logo, a text, a title for a vlog. Maybe the letters are standing on top of a building. Do that in here, just track it in After Effects, and then it's applied, ready to go in Premiere. You don't have to render out clips and import them again and go back and render them out if you want to change something. It's all just connected, which is super helpful. So that's it. Those are the final little tools. Another quick shout out, I suppose, is to crop. This is a fairly straightforward effect. You put it on footage, you crop the edges. You can even click the name of the effect and you get up these borders, and you can just drag them around wherever you want to crop your footage, rather than having to sit around with these finicky values and go like, I want it to be 36.2 maybe. But other than that, I think we've covered most of the effects that I use most often. If I go through my presets here, you can see that, for example, this effect of pulling the face cam in and out, if I attach that to some footage, I've now applied a transformation effect so that I get the motion blur of just stuff coming in from the left and stopping center screen. And I have the same thing for right, in, and out, and out. And you can see that they always apply. If I drag the right one on, you can see that it applies to the end of the clip, and the other one applies to the start of the clip, so that the footage swooshes in and then swooshes out. The way you do this is, if you have an effect that you want to save, for example, you'd want to save this for some reason, if you right-click it and you save a preset, in the saving the preset option, you can anchor it to the in point or the out point. So essentially what I did is make a animation with the transformation effect, and then I'd save it to in point for when the camera comes in, or out point for when the camera goes out. And then it'll, no matter how long the footage is, it'll always apply it to the start or the end of the footage. If you set it to scale, it'll take whatever you've done and scale it to fit the entire footage. So if it's a really long clip, obviously the motion will be really slow. And if it's a really short clip, it'll be really fast. But that's a good thing to know. I have a face cam preset here, which is just if I drag that on, it'll position the camera and crop it to fit where it's always supposed to be. I have multiple presets for multiple things. I'll use my hotkey that I mentioned last time, number 1, to remove effects. Bam, it's all gone. I have some audio effects, some reverb effects, some color correction effects, all of these things that I've manually made over time that I just like to reuse sometimes, so I just save them and I don't have to do it all over again. That is it. Those are some effects and techniques that I use on the reg. You have the alt drag to copy footage, you have the glitching, you have the echo, some color corrections options, gamma, curves, a lot of useful stuff, I hope. So, well, hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you might be able to apply some of these techniques to your own videos. It doesn't have to be in Premiere. I'm sure there are equivalences for these effects in other editing softwares as well. But that's gonna be it. So, until next time, take care. Farewell.